Folks, I wonder if we can hear me now.
This meeting is being recorded.
So it seems as though we do have audio. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you very much for being here. I must admit, I was told by folks in the room that there were quite a lot of RSVPs for the meeting, and I am very, very excited to be sharing some of my ideas with folks this afternoon. Two things that I just want to put up, as a kind of what do they call it, as a prefacing word. I don't have slides. I'm very I'm young, but I'm old-fashioned in that way. Unfortunately, I don't have slides, so I'll be talking to reading and talking to the paper, right? That's the work that I'll be doing. My name is Sisebo Kumalo. I am a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Port Hare here in South Africa. I have institutional affiliations with quite a couple of institutions in South Africa. I am concluding a doctoral study with the University of Pretoria. I am a Litsema visiting fellow at the University of Johannesburg. And further afield in the North American context, I am a Harvard South African fellow based in the Center for African Studies in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts. So that's just basically a little bit about myself. I'm going to talk today to something that I think speaks to work that I've been doing for quite a while now, right? So I've been working on the decolonial, what I'm in another piece, what I'm conceptualizing as the decolonial question/problem, right? And one of the critical things that we often get in the South African Academy, in any case, and I think this is weird and strange because of how we are positioned as South Africa, we often get the claim that we don't know what is intended or what is meant by this concept of decolonization. So a lot of folks will say, and people have actually published on this, our good colleagues, Aretha Piri, as well as Edwin Etiebo, Aretha Piri of Rhodes University, Edwin Etiebo of Wits University, have both put out books that kind of make this claim, right? They suggest, and I'm very critical of it. I'm not even going to lie. I'm very, very critical of the suggestion that we do not understand what is intended by the demand for decolonization. So the supposed suggestion there is that while we don't know what to do, right, with this whole idea that we ought to decolonize, and I suggest that in our context, that's a bit weird, right? That's very, very weird, because it means that we're reading certain people while blatantly ignoring others, right? So that's to suggest, for instance, that we're not engaging what I call the Black Archive, right? So in the Black Archive, and we've just recently had a symposium of the Black Archive, bringing scholars together such as Siphamandla Zondi of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, Hlonipha Mokoena, Associate Professor at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, Ian McQueen of the University of Pretoria. So all of us coming together to really think about, what is intended by this concept of the Black Archive, because we're all doing similar kind of work. So the paper that I'm going to present to you this evening basically talks to this project, right? So what we're trying to do is that I'm trying to outline a decolonial methodology using the Black Archive. And I'm trying to do this work because I'm fascinated by, number one, reading Indigenous Black folk who were concerned with questions of Blackness, the fact of Blackness, as I call it in my scholarship, even as they were excluded from formal sites of knowledge production, an exclusion that finds its first formal articulation in 1870 under James Stewart Principalship at Lovedale College, when he makes the distinction between the academic stream for white students and what he calls basically the artisanal kind of stream for Black students, putting Black students to wagon making, bookbinding, and agriculture, right? And this distinction had not been made prior to 1870 under William Goven's principalship at Lovedale College. So there's a shift that takes place, and that shift, of course, begins to formalize itself more brutally and more violently as Bantu education, and of course the extension of university education in 59, right? So I'm interested basically in the work of reading folks who had trained necessarily in the more academic streams, the likes of Ogoba, the likes of Omkhai, the likes of Make Mafuze, in Make Mafuze down in KZN with Colenso's work. So I'm interested in reading those folks and taking them seriously, right? Because I do find that often what tends to happen is that South African Academy has basically kind of peripherized the contribution of Black intellectuals, right? Black intellectuals who are interested in the question of Blackness in South Africa. And I then ask myself the question of, well, how then do we understand the function of education if we're not interested in these people? So concerning myself then with decolonial methodology is deliberate, as I aim to address a series of concerns. Firstly, I am interested in outlining for both myself and scholars working in the South African context a decolonial methodology that embraces the knowledge of indigenous peoples of South Africa. This addresses the incorrigible claim propounded by scholars who obfuscate decolonial theorizing. Consider Phiri's African philosophical and literary possibilities when she writes, "Yet the terms and process of epistemological decolonization continue to be disputed. What precisely constitutes pedagogical curriculum Africanization remains unclear." And Etiebo's Decolonization, Africanization, and the Philosophy curriculum, who claims that conceptually a lot of controversies surround it. That is, of course, decolonization, as to what it means or what it doesn't mean. And I find this a really, really fundamentally problematic claim, because it means that our conception of what constitutes knowledge and the knowledge project is quite limited. Language in this regard plays a crucial role, as the Black archive has been developed in the indigenous languages of the region. Secondarily, I respond to Unyoka's contention, a claim that I support to the extent that it inspires such an analysis, that at the moment, South African intellectual debates are stale. This is partly because we do not reflect on old ideas, and to freshen up our debates, we should revisit the ideas of intellectuals like Mafeje and his peers, close quote. That's taken from Ubongani Nyoka's The Social and Political Thought of Archie Mafeje. The failure he diagnoses is twofold. Primarily, knowledge that is developed in the languages of the region has been eschewed in keeping with the discourses that were established by colonial imposition. That is, when developing decolonial theory, theorists who are still spellbound by colonial logics disregard knowledge contained in the local languages of South Africa. Secondarily, a fixation with new knowledge, as if knowledge was ever new and not merely a recitation of the old, styled in new garb, sees historical considerations as outdated, resultantly undermining any genuine philosophical contribution that emanates from our context. And this is what I'm after, really engaging philosophically with knowledge that is produced in South Africa. Resisting the reproductions of colonial thought disguised as an engagement with decolonial theory, a guise that engages with this tradition only insofar as it is fashionable to produce a decolonial scholarship, my methodology stakes two objections against Aretha Phiri and Etiebo, who treat decolonization as a metaphor in my reading of their scholarship. The first objection highlights fashionable engagements that create of decoloniality a vapid theoretical movement that becomes an empty signifier, representative of everything and nothing at the same time. Mine, then, I would suggest, guards against obfuscating moves that recolonize decolonial debates. The second objection addresses, albeit in implicit form, the epistemic hierarchy that would have the decolonial thinker or decolonial thinkers deferentially and substantively engaged in this area of scholarship outlines such a methodology in the first instance. Put differently, outlining a decolonial methodology is premised on analyzing decoloniality as theoretical discourse, using the concept of political obligation. Such a conceptual move enlivens indisciplinarity as suggested by Mignolo. Indisciplinarity sidesteps disciplinary restrictions for their part in abrogating analyses that are both holistic in their historicity and socially responsive to situational contexts, while augmenting the position that, again, from Munyoga, social scientists who subscribe to the notion of value-free inquiry often miss the point that lived experiences play a crucial role in how one perceives the world and therefore how one constructs knowledge, close quote. Again, quoting from Munyoga, what is essential in understanding social change, Makubane argues, is a total historical analysis, close quote. I will expound on the objections against a fashionable engagement with decoloniality and the epistemic hierarchy in the argument of the paper. Presently, in what follows, I defend my uses of political philosophy as the conceptual landscape that allows and holds my project. This allows my argument to attend to one of the pressing questions that decolonization and decoloniality, both in praxis and theoretical forms, are grappling with both in the country as well as in other contexts. And I would suggest that we're grappling with notions of belonging predicated on national culture. Insofar as South Africa is grappling with these questions, it becomes clear why I have elected rather to analyze the process of decolonization and theory emanating from decoloniality using the framework of political obligation. I move on now to think about belonging as culture, responding to historical exclusions through writing. So developing a decolonial methodology within the ambit of political philosophy overcomes an epistemological impulse rooted in the assessment that, and again I quote from Munyoga, in singling out colonial anthropology as the problem, its critics were undialectical, close quote, subsequently inaugurating an impasse. Overcoming the impasse suggests developing knowledge in Africa that is responsive to African problems while critiquing the bourgeois social sciences. For, and again from Munyoga, it should be remembered that for Mafeja, anthropology was in the colonies what other social sciences were in the metropolitan countries. And so to single out anthropology and leave out the other social sciences is a form of mystification, close quote. At issue is the marginalization of knowledge, specifically the ways of knowing of those who have suffered domination. Historically, this marginalization has been ascribed to anthropology as discipline on the continent. And of course, Mudimbe's analysis on the invention of Africa gives us quite a systematic analysis. While this assessment is useful, I propose that the task of developing knowledge be seen for what it is, a contestation rather of how the world ought to be arranged. For if the reader should remember, the reader should remember that knowledge making is as contested as politics. This justifies the uses of the conceptual analysis deployed, that is political obligation. Political obligation framed as a question by those who challenge the constitutionality of our constitution, or our context rather, when they challenge why I am to regard any knowledge as superior and indeed of any acquiescing to its superiority. This process invites us to pose two subsidiary questions, I would suggest. As already detailed, knowledge making influences the lived realities of the polity. The shift between knowledge and the arrangement of political affairs, a shift that sometimes takes on a mode that is indistinguishable in my writing here, an indistinguishability between politics from knowledge or knowledge from politics is intentional and demonstrates with some veracity the point that the two influence each other and determine the conditions of possibility for each other. The prevailing knowledge system determines the socio-political condition, which in turn influences what knowledge is deemed worthy to be sanctioned as permissible in any given social context. And this is, of course, the reason why I say we've got to look at why the scholarship and the thinking of indigenous Black intellectuals has been jettisoned or has been peripherized or marginalized. So it is for this reason that knowledge making is framed as contentious as politics. As already evident and in signifying my objectives, I test the first propositional claim that decolonial theory is invested in the critique. Such a move highlights why I take this proposition to be the founding principle for the theoretical developments I aim to undertake in the paper. Moreover, it undergirds why I will spend some time explicating the decolonial critique, which, while I attempt to transcend, is still useful, as it reveals how this debate mirrors political obligation. I expound on this proposition using the South African context, because South Africa's colonial history is fraught with a series of contestations with respect to whom rightfully can claim belonging in the country. And of course, I think the question of belonging is a really, really interesting one. Now, belonging gives rise to political contestations for a series of reasons, but the principal reason to which I will pay mind is the reality that national culture has always been exclusive and exclusionary, sometimes in violent forms as witnessed in the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1895. As a result of this violence, we see, as but one example, uGqoba, in an address to the Native Education Association on January 6, 1888, concluding by saying that from what he had seen, he was glad he was not a white man. Similarly, Tio Soka, in his letters to his children who were born of a Scottish mother, advises them thusly, and I'm quoting here directly from Tio Soka: I want you, for your future comfort, to be very careful on this point. If you do not wish to feel the taunt of men, which you will sometimes be made to feel, take your place in the world as colored, not as white men, as Kaffirs, not as Englishmen. Now, of course, close quote. Now, I'm using the concept as he had used it in his own writing. The Witchcraft Suppression Act then of 1895 subsequently comes after a series of debates that characterized indigeneity's position in the polemical debate on the matter of Christian conversion, with some in favor of Christianity and advocating a shift from the life that existed prior to the introduction of the Christian moral economy. Consider Koppa's closing remarks in his address to the Lovedale Literary Society in 1885, when he claims, and I quote again, "May the day come when we natives of this country shall have altogether been freed from the power of heathenism in all its forms, and when we in turn shall willingly, and out of the same love that prompted the Britons to sacrifice everything for Christ's sake, do the same for our benighted countrymen," close quote. Now, Koppa's thinking and writing should not, however, be mistaken as a seamless acquiescence that is without contestation. For as Opland reminds us, and I quote again, Koppa's adoption of Western forms in his poetry and compositional style as vehicles for the expression of social and political protest employs the strategy recommended by Unsigana of accepting white innovations on Xhosa terms, of exploiting Western innovations to encourage and maintain pride in Xhosa identity. This is substantiated in the attitude adopted by Koppa, an attitude that was defined by subtle resistances that were opposed to the wholesale obliteration of Black ontology through wiping out Xhosa identity and heritage. Koppa's work attests to this insofar as uGqoba is able to express criticism of the conduct of those who pay lip service to Christianity as well as support Xhosa custom and tradition. As Here and Now, one of his compositions recurrently argues, this present world is just fine as it is. Koppa facilitates a mediated ground, I would suggest, one that advances the indigenous worldview without capitulation, recounting the folklore of a woman who cannot conceive and picks up a baby that is otherworldly, which subsequently turns into a beast that devours the woman. Quoting again from Opland, "The dangerous baby to whom the woman shows misplaced kindness can readily be seen as whites and European culture, against the unthinking adoption of which Unsigana had warned in 1821 upon his departure from this world." Through his compositional style and sustained critique, Koppa offers arguments from a Christian perspective without denying his Xhosa heritage, and in so doing, points the way to the future, Nsigana's way, I would suggest. Now, Donovan Williams documents this succinctly. He says, "Christianity qua Christianity did not produce conflict. It was when Christianity attacked the customs and rights," again quoting directly, "of Kaffirs, that it became a menace to Kaffir society and the chiefs in particular," close quote. This exclusionary culture was formalized using violence to maintain this new order through the socio-political proclamation that South Africa belonged only to whiteness and its progeny. And it was for this reason that the Freedom Charter claims that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, an assertion that is a counterclaim to the attempts that seek to wipe out the existence of Blackness along with its labor in the country. Now, of course, the claim of whiteness attempting to appropriate South Africa to itself is substantiated in Coetzee's assertion. This is J.M. Coetzee's white writing, that, and I quote, if the work of hands on a particular patch of earth, digging, plowing, planting, building, is what inscribes it as the property of its occupiers by right, then the hands of black serfs doing the work had better not be seen. And I think a lot of people tend to misread Coetzee because that particular analysis, white writing, was incredibly incisive in demonstrating the ways in which Blackness is erased out of the question of national culture in South Africa. Note here that the inauguration of apartheid, that is, segregated coexistence, has its roots precisely in legislation such as the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1895, which sought to impose the Christian moral economy on the indigent by criminalizing Black indigenous ontology. The literary scape of the country details this systematically. Subsequently, I follow George Hull in that, and I quote, since the most adequate response to some types of value conflict may well be a creative act, value conflict is an area where philosophical theory and creative fiction can helpfully inform one another, close quote. To be sure, again quoting from George Hall, I argue that the palpable sense of hope at the end of both Imombo Yeminyanya and disgrace is explained in each case by the reader's sense of the possibility of compromise, which is not purely instrumental, but is a deep, creative, and adequate response to the conflicting legitimate moral claims in play, close quote. These conflicting legitimate moral claims direct us to the case of belonging, which ought to be reconciled owing to two competing worldviews that exist as predicated on their desire to create a coeval sense of national culture in South Africa. Such a project is only possible, I would suggest, if we heed the cautionary remark by Nyoga that knowledge-making isn't a value-free, red-neutral exercise. Now, George Hall's use of South African literature as a tool that resolves morally competing and equally legitimate claims with literature informing philosophical theory about value conflict is what substantiates my use of historical texts that form the constitutive parts, I would suggest, of the Black Archive. And I've written on this, and if folks are interested, they can look that up. These historical considerations are found in the literary aesthetic domain, that is, the poetry of Kopa that first appeared in Isikitim Samaxhosa in 1888. In terms of my particular analysis with respect to where I'm drawing from, and I'm thinking precisely here of that epic poem that he did, Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo. Literature, therefore, as aesthetic artifact and communicative device, is the vehicle that expresses the national culture and identity of a people. As Morrison contends in her seminal Nobel Prize speech, the use of language in state formation can have both liberating and debilitating effects. She suggests, Morrison that is, that there is and will be more seductive mutant language designed to throttle women, to pack their throats like pate-producing geese with their own unsayable transgressive words. There will be more of the language of surveillance disguised as research, of politics and history calculated to render the suffering of millions mute, language glamorized to thrill the dissatisfied and bereft into assaulting their neighbors, arrogant pseudo-empirical language, crafted to lock creative people into cages of inferiority and hopelessness, close quote. Modes of writing as detailed by Coetzee in White Writing on the Culture of Letters in South Africa, as national literature in South Africa has been developed, sanctioned, and legitimated by white writers, have occluded Blackness and indigeneity. This occlusion, first inaugurated in the 19th century, continues to bedevil the country, with Oplan detailing that initially, under the principalship of William Govan, Lovedale offered its students, both black and white, a non-discriminatory academic education that included the study of Latin and Greek, geometry, and mathematics. It was in 1870, when James Stewart assumed the headship, that he introduced a deferential system with white pupils following an academic curriculum and black students pursuing vocational courses such as agriculture, wagon making, and bookbinding. This occlusion that frames only whiteness as capable of knowledge making or worthy of the enterprise has seen the erasure and silencing of literature written in the indigenous languages of the region, an occlusion that continues to this very day, with some suggesting that what is intended by decolonization is not clear. This fashions an exclusionary national culture that only values a Christian moral economy and whiteness. The novelty in the use of works developed in indigenous languages aids my proposed methodology, which contests these claims by showcasing how this literature holds competing values in tandem, demonstrating the usefulness of compromise as argued by Hall. Moreover, language is a tool of culture, and as it informs the political conditions of possibility, is detailed by Nadine Gordimer when she thinks through the literary scape and the consciousness that is constitutive thereof, which subsequently addresses these conditions and how they inform the nation-building project through the institutionalization of culture. Now, I think I want to pause for a second in the sense of I want to take us to a footnote that I suggest or that I detail here, which is to say literature is a vehicle of national culture, matter that Zoe Wickham applies herself to in that seminal essay, Culture Beyond Color, when she maintains that, and I quote, "We need a radical pedagogy, a level of literacy that will allow our children to read works of literature that will politicize them into an awareness not only of power, but also of the equivocal, the ambiguous, and the ironic that is always embedded in power." Close quote. As such, a dead language is not only one no longer in use or written. It is unyielding language, content to admire its own paralysis. Paralysis obliges decoloniality to critique and petrifies it from developing knowledge that is responsive, wherein alternative voices speak back to power. Paralysis devotes an inability to reconcile two competing worldviews of both the indigen and the settler. A said language, read literature that is prized and given pride of place, is the settler's language and culture. The propositional claim is that a way out of this paralysis is found in the writing of Black indigenous intellectuals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Furthermore, in the present political moment wherein the imagination of our leaders suffers from a sense of paralysis, in that they fail to fashion a cohesive national identity that doesn't appeal to essentialist thinking, we are privy to what Morrison calls status language, which is censored rather and censoring. Ruthless in its policing duties, it has no desire or purpose other than maintaining the free range of its own narcotic narcissism, its own exclusivity and dominance. This dearth inspires this project owing to the reality that our political leaders have predicated their vision of national culture on white writing, as sanctioned by the thinking of the prevailing intellectual fads of white intelligentsia, which do well to obfuscate the place of decolonial thinking and theory. Zoe Wickham substantiates this claim when she observes that the question of a national language, read literature, has always been at the heart of the notion of nation. Brought into being by language, the concept of nation then becomes subsumed by language. And I quite like that concept. I really, really do, because we cannot necessarily articulate the concept of a nation without the language to do so. She continues to say, what passes for the testing of literacy understood as a competence in language as denotative of nation, that is belonging, is none other than the social conventions of a dominant class rather than universal logic, right? And so I would suggest that she actually suggests that we need to radically revisit what we consider to be national culture then as a result. Confronted by this exclusivity and dominance, Gordimer argues that it is certain that political pressures in the form of a deep sense of injustice and inhumanity existing within a writer's society can cause certain writers to question the luxury of writing at all within a country like South Africa. Wickham frames this situation as follows. The question is surely what to do about those real voices that intrude upon us, writers understood doubly as cultural workers, as we sit down to write, how to continue the activity of writing that is disturbed by the beggars beating at our doors for food, how not to think of writing in this context as a shameful activity that does little or nothing about redistributing cultural and linguistic capital. While one might object to an inversion of a second order preoccupation that is developing literature and the aesthetic, with the inversion being the use of literature to answer questions of political philosophy, a response to this objection is found in the work of Mazisi Gunene, Nadine Gordimer, and Zoe Wickham. While I appreciate this objection and its attempts at ensuring that we do not sully the disciplinary constitution of literature, literary theory, and criticism, My response aims to see South African cultural workers functioning to resolve the challenges inherited from the historical project of apartheid. In a different way, I'm interested in the use of literature for the purposes of liberating writing from its shame-inducing properties, detailed by Wickham and Gordimer. Literature in this sense acts or informs action through the cultivation of a national culture that holds in tandem competing and oppositional identities in a post-colony. This predisposition of literature and its uses is found in the thinking and writing of William Wellington Gopa, who represents a radical social pedagogy that nurtures coexistence. Such a predisposition sidesteps the epistemological fads of academics who claim to be writing in the area of decolonization, but are in fact concerned with obfuscation for the continued preservation of the pride of place of whiteness and its exclusionary logic, or logics. Gopa liberates social imagination from a language that is content with admiring its own paralysis, its own narcotic narcissism that encodes violence. He embodies the act of literature as it informs philosophical theory. Now, conjoining the two disciplines, literature and philosophy, in answering salient questions of political importance that are located in the realm of political philosophy, defines, I would suggest, the novelty of such a methodology as it deploys what Mignolo terms interdisciplinarity, which uses decolonial theory as it is constitutive of the seminal critiques seen to date. This takes us, I would suggest, beyond the critique and proffers substantive theoretical propositions while attending to the dearth of engaging the Black archive and decolonial theory locally. Nearly all of the contemporary political and philosophical questions that vex scholars have been considered historically by figures such as Herbert Lomo, John Tembo Jabavu, A.C. Jordan, Nontsisi Mkweto, to mention the constitutive contributors to this Black archive that I talk about. Now, engaging the Black archive through the use of a decolonial methodology is subsequently useful if we are to respond meaningfully to contemporary socio-political problems. Detailing, I now move on to a section entitled Detailing a Decolonial Methodology and Transcending the Critique. Now that I've kind of painted a picture for us of what the decolonial critique is constitutive of, showcasing the importance that it continues to have, I proceed to detail the constitutive components of such a methodology. The reader should read me carefully, as I do not suggest a wholesale abandonment of the critique, as it continues to have significance even in the work that I am doing here. I do not wish for a decolonial methodology. I do not wish for a decolonial methodology, specifically one that is rooted in the Black archive, to be seen as an ahistorical and apolitical undertaking. My reservation is cognizant of the pitfalls of creating a colonial vestige of only one disciplinary formation, be it anthropology, philosophy, literature, or sociology. What I seek to advance is a wholesale reimagination of the disciplinary constitution or disciplinary constitutions as they facilitate belonging and national culture. And this now is the methodology that I am getting at. And I will ask for colleagues to bear with me for a number of reasons. The first of which is to say that I get a bit technical from here on, right? I do get a bit technical, but I hope that folks will be able to follow. So I am interested subsequently in a university that is A, decolonized. Now, A is made up of two parts. Now, a decolonized institution, I would suggest, advances the first part, which is thinking that is responsive to our geographical locale. And the second part of the decolonized institution is the part that affords the contemporary intellectual the tools with which to fashion theory that coevally holds competing identities in tandem. In this particular framework, what I have termed A, the decolonized university with its two constitutive parts, A1 and A2, cannot nor should they be read separately. They are the constitutive whole of decolonization, which culminates in a decolonized cultural institution that is the university, if we are to conceptualize it as such. Now, I speak of the university from the position of my discipline, which is philosophy, situated then in the humanities, which is why I term it a cultural institution, that is the university. Now, these three cumulative moves give us what I am most interested in, B, which is the ability to develop theory using the Black archive. Theory that is responsive, and C, future-oriented. So let's repeat that. So A is that I'm looking for a decolonized university that gives me the ability to develop theory using the Black archive. That's B. And C, theory that is responsive and future-oriented. Right? I'm concerned with the future orientation that enables the coevalness that Williams details above. In explicating, consider when Hannah Arendt suggests the following about revolution vis-a-vis liberation and freedom. The point of the matter is that the former, liberation, the desire to be free from oppression, could very well have been fulfilled under monarchical, though not tyrannical rule, whereas the latter, freedom, necessitated the formation of a new, or rather rediscovered form of government, close quote. The claim that whereas the latter, the realization of freedom, necessitated a rediscovered form of government, suggests the cyclical nature of knowing and being. This is to say that there isn't nor has ever been a discovery of new, albeit there can be novelties discovered in the old knowledge. Merely a shifting, perhaps a reversal of the order, such that the social conditions emulate what once existed. In our case, this rediscovery denotes differentiality afforded to the ontology of the other, whom self-referentially adopted the category of kafir, in protest of its uses and meaning as used by white colonial settlers in our context, a word that came to be deeply derogatory in the country. This concept must, however, be understood temporarily. Here, detail is required. Opland, using R.H.W. Shepard, reminds us that this concept came to define the indigent as inferior, owing to William Govan being sacrificed because his conviction was that a primitive people could best be educated first by the highest education of the few, and James Stewart took his place as principal because he advocated rather first the elementary education of the many. Stewart's thinking fashioned a culture that associated the indigent with inferiority and a second-class citizenship status, ultimately creating of the indigent servants of white masters who had come to save the heathenous barbarians. And of course, I hope we realize the sarcasm in that claim. This arrogance then of white saviorism is seen in the Christian versus heathens debate, to which I have already paid sufficient attention. Importantly, and as a derivative of this white saviorist culture that came to dominate the thinking of whiteness in South Africa, knowledge is knowledge only insofar as it is developed by white scholars, a propositional claim that continues to play itself out to this very day. It is for these reasons that we had the call to decolonize the university, again, which invites the question of how can that not be clear in and of itself? Maybe colleagues are just deaf, I don't know. Maybe we cannot read the landscape, I'm not certain. Now, the objection that is put against Piri and Etiebo is illumined when the reader considers that precisely the calls for decolonization are found in the languages of the region, languages that were actively working to undo these inferiorizing moves that treated Black indigenous ontology as synonymous with witchcraft and heathenism, a treatment that was predicated on yet another form of arrogance that did not consider alternative cosmologies as legitimate. To recount, we have a decolonized university with its derivative constitutive parts, and A gives us an institution that is able to develop theory using the Black archive, theory that's, of course, the B component, and theory that is responsive to that is developed from the Black archive that is then responsive to our context, that is C, right? So I'm basically trying to just spell out in very, very simple terms, I would like to suggest what is intended by this notion of decolonization, because at the end of the day, as intellectuals and as academics, specifically in the humanities, in any case, we are funded by the public purse. Moving from A through to C can be done using, as but one example, the historical literary texts of William Wellington Cook. And it must be noted that these texts are themselves a constitutive part of the Black archive, which proffers an articulation of a responsive knowledge economy, a responsiveness that deals with belonging in South Africa. My reader should not misread me to be suggesting that Kopa is the only individual to which we can turn in such an exercise. I'm not suggesting that at all. Gopa is a demonstration, and he facilitates how the contributions of indigenous intellectuals and artists broaden our ability to develop theory locally. To this end, there are 4 constitutive conceptual moves that get us to A, which is the decolonized university. Language or linguistics, cultural understanding, so that language and linguistics is the first component, cultural understanding is the second component, historical awareness, and this is very, very important, being the third component, an historical awareness of the socio-political conditions that necessitate decolonization, and the fourth and final move, hermeneutical precision. I wonder if I should do this, but let me try. How am I doing for time, Vanessa? Okay, good. Okay. I want to now apply this methodology. The technicalities move further at this point. So I'm going to, again, ask that folks bear with me. So these components give us access and insights into an understanding of Black indigenous ontology as it is articulated and framed by the indigent, right? So step 1, conceptual step 1 to step 4, sidestep impositions of the colonial settler and their descendant, justifying the preoccupations of Black intellectuals of the 19th century, who, as Opland says of Gopa, developed work that contested the misreadings of Black indigenous ontology. His, that is Gopa's corpus, is a rebuttal of white historical misrepresentations of Xhosa history, but eschews Western academical argumentation in its deployment of a native Xhosa exegesis. And I think we find the substantiation of this point, or the rearticulation of this point, recently in Ian McQueen's work, right? Where McQueen suggests that the process of both teaching and developing historiography requires us not only to look to historical writing as it has been developed by white colleagues in South Africa. We need, he suggests, to broaden our horizons, and he invites the question of language in that paper of his, where he treats what it's been like teaching a historiography course at an honors level in Yesterday and Today. So that paper appeared with Yesterday and Today in 2019. The primacy that is given to language and linguistics is conscious and deliberate in acknowledging that English is not the mother tongue of many who were contributing and continue to contribute to the Black archive. Remember that, as Unene has it, this was the language that was the cause of the death of many of our ancestors. To this extent, I define the Black archive as a collection of historical artifacts, written, that is, newspaper publications, poetry and literary works, music, artworks, and political treatises developed by Black indigenous people, even as they were excluded from formal sites of knowledge production, that is the university in South Africa. So historically, or in a previous publication rather, I have maintained that this corpus theorized and continued to think through the fact of Blackness during conditions that constrained Black indigenous people politically, economically, and socially. As suggested in the language and linguistic component, it is a crucial element that details Black ontology not as a derivative of colonial inventions and colonial misframings, but rather as an account of Black ontology on our own terms. So what I'm suggesting here is that if we take the first conceptual move, which is the language and linguistics component, I'm not responding to categories that have been invented for me, right? I'm not responding to the concept of having to, translate stuff into my own language, because in the first instance, and this is a suggestion that I trouble this concept of translating Shakespeare, for instance, into isiZulu, into isiZulu or Sotho or isiXhosa. And I trouble this because in isiZulu alone, for instance, as Gunene explicates it for us, we have, I think, about 5 literary genres, right? Which are not that well known. And the person I suggest who makes the suggestion of translation is making that suggestion from an epistemically racist position, in that they do not even see the integrity of our languages as worthy in and of itself to be studied, such that, you know what, if you're going to do this thing, that is the academy, you've got to do it on these terms, because we've already developed world-class literature. And I'm thinking, on whose terms have we developed world-class literature? Because it's only a matter of hegemonic culture that prescribes that literature as world-class. Now, the Black Register, as Sitole would suggest, does this as well for us, right? In very, very interesting terms of facilitating the engagement of Black ontology on our own terms and not having to constantly speak back. And Tendai Setole already does some cool work in that book in terms of outlining how we do this project. Now, the language and linguistics component will always be mediated by epistemology. That is, epistemology is sine qua non first philosophy in this instance. I am suggesting that epistemology is first philosophy qua philosophy, even in politics. For the domain of politics, or more precisely, political philosophy, I take ontology, the fact of being, to be first philosophy. However, in my methodology, it is subsumed in epistemology, which facilitates the capacity to make sense of that ontology in the first respect. So if we locate, simply put, if I'm thinking about language and linguistics as the entry point into my methodology, surely the capacity to interpret, analyze, and think through the linguistic or language claims that I make is derived from an epistemological grid that is held within that particular language. So that's why I say epistemology here for me holds the ontology, because it facilitates our capacity to articulate the ontological experience. For the decolonial theorist who has the access to the world of the indigent, as this world is pried open by language or linguistic ability, the following questions surface, and these questions concern our engagement with language and linguistics. What critique is the progenitor of the text in its original form intending? So when I'm reading Ugoba, as he's writing in 1885, for instance, in his, what do they call it, in his literary address, I mean, in his address to the Native Education Association, what is the intended critique that he is giving, right? Such that I don't conjecture him so that he works for me. What claim does Ugoba aim to have the reader apply themselves to, right? So there's the question of intention, then there's the question of what is the claim that he wants me to think about. And of course, the third component in thinking through the language and linguistics conceptual move of the possible answers to what claim Ugoba is asking me to apply myself to, which is the most apt, and how do I corroborate it with valid conclusions, right? So, and again, because I'm trying to move away from a place where I can conjecture or kind of misrepresent these scholars, because again, they're writing in a very, very, in a time that's about 200 years away from me. So I'm thinking here about this concept of, I think it was C.S. Lewis and Kyle Backton who talk about this concept of receiving a text as opposed to using a text. Insofar as the decolonial theorist might not have access to this world owing to their lack of language or linguistic ability, a lack that is not exclusionary insofar as these texts have been translated and engaged outside of the languages of their progenitors, hermeneutical precision becomes central to the linguistic analysis of step one in my conceptual, in my conceptual grid. The question posed under the treatment conducted in move one, or the questions rather, so what critique is the progenitor intending? What claim is he wanting me to apply myself to, or is she wanting me to apply myself to? And of the possible answers, what is most apt and how do I corroborate it? Of all of those components, right, the questions posed under language and linguistics edify the second move, right? And the second move, of course, is the move concerning questions. What is the second one? Sorry, I'm losing myself a bit. It's under cultural understanding, right? So if I'm thinking about the language and linguistics analysis, how does that give me a better understanding of the cultural position from which the individual is articulating, or the author is articulating himself? Does the critique, and these are the questions that surface now under getting at a cultural understanding or an insight into cultural understanding. Does the critique surfaced change in culture itself an instantiation of decolonial resistance, right? So is the critique that is being leveled by, for instance, Ugoba in 1885, does it surface changes in culture, right? So is he saying that certain things have changed or have certain things stayed the same, right? As I have arrived at a corroborated understanding of what he wants, of the claim that he wants me to apply myself to. Is the claim that Ugoba wanted me to apply myself to when he was speaking in 1885 still relevant and valid today? What has changed since the claim was put by Ukopa himself to his audience? And the last component says, do the first two questions augment or challenge the conclusions that I arrived at when I was corroborating what is intended by the claim and what is intended by the meaning that, that the progenitor of the text wants me to apply myself to. The third and conceptual moves do not require such probing questions as the first two, right? So in the sense that if I'm thinking about the linguistic and language component as well as cultural understanding, when I move on to historical awareness and hermeneutic and hermeneutical precision, I'm not requiring these subsidiary questions that I've asked, for instance, of language and linguistics and cultural understanding. But they do reveal deeper insights when applied to the first two moves. That is, historical awareness will inform the thinking under the suggestions or the responses that we get from the questions around, does the critique still stand? What has surfaced in terms of the changes that the critique is trying to suggest? How, one would ask, this question can be answered in two ways. In the first regard, one thinks about the fact that all those who were and continue to contribute to the Black Archive analyzed three questions: the social conditions under which Black life lives, with English and its attendant cultural values and mores being a language that is borrowed, a language of visitors, as it is said in our own languages, there is a world that existed and continues to exist, even if this world was deemed the world of heathens. The continuation of this world, with its own language, traditions, culture, and mores, is seen in the epic poem penned by Ukopa that treats the debate of the Christian and the heathen. Ukopa was aware of the resistance to Christian conversion seen in the question posed to Soka's attempts at convincing Black indigenous people to take on this foreign religion. Now, this is captured by a question that, as I say, was posed to Tio Soka by those who were not necessarily convinced by the uptake of the Christian faith, Amakaba, as we know them. So this one particular question says, we have nothing to say, but it strikes me that the reference to this thing, Christianity, the way in which it has come to us is not right. I do not see how we can receive it, yet I do not yet say it is not true. The owner of it has cut the thing in the middle and done it by halves. You know that we are the remnants of past generation of Kafirs. Again, I'm quoting him. Why was the word not sent to our forefathers so that we should have received it through them in the natural course of things, right? So the questions that are asked, even as the decolonial moves, or I mean, the colonial project is taking place, the questions that are asked by Amakaba who are suggesting that actually this thing is weird. It's not necessarily quite sitting with how we understand to be receptive of quote unquote progress and development. Now, the political conditions under which Blackness and indigeneity had, read as continues to exist, is fundamentally important in this regard. It was these political conditions which, when they intensified by collaboration with oppressors, prompted some alterations to the original writings of Kopa, demonstrated by Ukhubusana's deletions, insertions, and additions to Kopa's work. Opland details the point when he says that 20 years after Kopa's death, Khubusana included many, though by no means all, of Kopa's writing in his anthology Zemgungoma Makwalandini. The second edition came out, by the way, in 1911, the first of which came out in 1906. But Khubusana was a cavalier editor, selecting extracts from longer works and freely inserting his own alterations and additions to the texts. It is not mine to pass judgment whether these deletions and additions were a result of active collaboration with the oppressors or coercive persuasion to get the text published. 3, the concept of culture, which is what, of course, is then becomes quite important in terms of our thinking. This is seen in Teosoka's approach to those who claimed or who continued practicing their traditions prior to censoring and censoring logics of the colonial masters who were lording over Blackness and indigeneity. Opland's account of Soka is as follows. Soka was tolerant to Xhosa custom. He was not opposed to circumcision as such, but sought a modification of its practices, such as smearing of the face and body with white clay. Circumcision, he claimed, was a civil and not a religious rite. Thus, accounts for these changes and thus accounts for these changes in terms of the changes that come under the third move, which is cultural understanding or historical awareness rather, and clarifies the conclusions reached by the decolonial theorist who is theorizing from the Black archive. Secondarily, the concept of historical awareness is as crucial to the preceding two moves, the linguistic understanding or linguistic insights in language, as well as the cultural understanding, right? And of course, it rests on the fact that historical awareness applies itself to the question that we give when we consider the question of to the answer that we give when we consider the question of, is the claim still relevant and what has changed since the claim was put by the progenitor, right? And this, of course, facilitates the generation of new theory, I would suggest. Put differently, if the world has changed in its cultural, political, and social forms between the present and the 19th or 20th century, the decolonial theorist or scholar must consider how and whether such changes alter the validity of the initial claim. Here, the decolonial theorist, I would suggest, transcends the critique while using it as the catalyst for generative theory development that attends to the current conditions. Now, Rubusana's work presses us to get into this concept of hermeneutical precision with as much sustained criticality as we have treated the preceding three conceptual moves, which necessitates hermeneutical precision, right? So the point that Oplan suggests of the fact that Rubusana is a cavalier editor, right, adding and deleting certain aspects of Ukopa's work, gives us the question of subjecting Rubusana's text to further analysis, scrutiny, and investigation, right? So we cannot just accept that actually Rubusana does a proper reprint of Ukopa's work, right? To explain, I draw the reader's attention back to the aspect of 1.3 of the possible answers to the question of what is the claim being propounded by the progenitor of the text, which of the answers is most apt, and how do I corroborate that such an answer is indeed valid? And of course, from once we've made that particular claim, we go back then again to say, is the claim that the progenitor is putting to us still relevant in the contemporary age? What has changed since the claim was put by the progenitor himself, right? So it takes us back to 1.3 in terms of the language aspect as well as the cultural understanding component. The first necessarily considers the validity of the conclusions at which the decolonialist arrives in relation to the intended meaning of the progenitor as per their inscription, while the second subjects the validity of such a conclusion to greater scrutiny using the question posed or the questions posed in the first and secondary move. To substantiate, for instance, what Milatza says when she notes that in note 1 of her chapter in that book, African Philosophical and Literary Possibilities, she says, notice that I refer to Tlali's novel as Between Two Worlds, not simply because this is the title used in the last edition, but because in the introduction included in the 2004 edition, Miriam Tlali writes that she prefers this title over Muriel et Metropolitan, which was imposed by censors, right? So what I'm getting at is that hermeneutical precision, I've got two examples here, basically. I've got Rubusana's example, where Rubusana basically includes and excludes certain aspects of Ukopa's work. And we've got Miriam Tlali's stuff as well, where the title to her own book changes. And she says, actually, the title that I prefer is the title of Between Two Worlds. And we see this in Marcia Milazzo's work. Tlali's Between Two Worlds highlights the first two considerations that preoccupy the contributors to the Black archive, that being the social and political conditions under which Blackness and indigeneity is made to live. In the case of Rubusana specifically, for those who do not have linguistic access and would thus be unable to pick up on the deletions, insertions, and additions made, the importance of hermeneutical precision is foregrounded. Now, I'm going to move on to the last bits, Vanessa, and I should begin concluding now, right? Exactly. I'm going to move on to the last components, colleagues. All right. So understanding decolonization, which is augmented by the sustained study, read analysis of Black indigenous ontology, an ontology that is not only graspable if one applies the methodology outlined above, substantiates an indisciplinary approach. It is in indisciplinarity, it is indisciplinary insofar as it does not conform to the structure of disciplines as they have been imported using a Western understanding of the arrangement of knowledge, which is itself telling of a westernized institution that might find itself located in Africa. This is predicated on the classification and analysis of attempts of concepts as they've been stated in the theoretical propositions of the Black Archive. Insofar as philosophical method lies in classifying and analyzing claims and methods in the sense of clarifying how we arrive at certain conclusions, a philosophical engagement of the Black Archive achieves the objectives of producing locally responsive knowledge while contributing to global disciplinary trajectory development. However, Mafeja challenges us, a challenge that further substantiates the given methodology, that the problem of anthropology, and we can easily include philosophy in this assessment, was primarily theoretical or universal rather than ideological or colonial. For merely to point out that anthropology was a handmaiden of colonialism was to present the argument in a partial and ideological way. That it was colonial could not have been its single diagnostic attribute. And I'm taking that from Ubongani Nyoga's work once again. Going further than Nyoga, the challenge with anthropology and philosophy lies precisely in the fact that these disciplines studied a context that was different to using imported tools. This importation of theory, which Nyoga critiques for its inability to diagnose the problems of Africa correctly and subsequently come up with adequate theoretical responses, signals the epistemic hierarchy that demands that one system of knowledge be given primacy of place in a context that had its own ways of knowing prior to colonial imposition. Put differently, the question with which we are confronted in this instance is one that seeks to understand why Africa and Africans ought to acquiesce to knowledge that dislodges the ontology of the African in the first instance. From where does a Western epistemic framework in a foreign land like Africa, or to be more precise, on the southernmost tip of the African continent, derive the political obligation which it forces from the people it seeks to expunge? In challenging the misplaced theses of Western thought using this methodology, this gives us the ultimate contribution of the Black Archive in our capacity to generate locally situated theoretical propositions and theses. This, in turn, better responds to the problems and challenges that afflict Africa through understanding how the state was constituted, its laws and governing morality, along with the requisite need to then abide political obligation as it is required of the citizenry. Undoubtedly, the function and role of historiography and historical studies as these disciplines inform such a methodology has become apparent, right? The third component, historical awareness, which accounts for the historical context in which change occurs, reveals the importance of the decolonial critique insofar as it concerns historical accuracy and accountability, with the additive move of transcending said critique such that we are able to arrive at McQueen's suggestion. Here, McQueen is instructive when he writes about the need to shift the gaze of historiographical writing. He maintains, and I'm quoting again from him, there's a wider range of lesser used authors and sources, but of these, of which there are approximately 20 sources, not one was a Black author, and only one source explicitly dealt with Black historical perceptions, written by a European scholar. The need for transformation and decolonization could not have been more strongly apparent. Interdisciplinarity moves away from the approaches of trans, multi, interdisciplinarity studies, insofar as methodology is indeed a disciplinary trap, a request to obey disciplinary regulations. And of course, one would then ask, well, then, Kumalo, why are you doing a methodology? And I have answered that question. Now, decoloniality demands epistemic and disciplinary disobedience, interdisciplinarity rather than inter or transdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity becomes fundamental to the project of a decolonial methodology insofar as it questions a knowledge system that demands political obligation while persistently adumbrating violence in accordance with historical violences. This methodology proves that the thinking and writing of scholars like Ukopa not only sidesteps the shame-inducing character of writing by tackling persistent socio-political questions, but also allows us to fashion an amicable social contract that holds two competing identities in tandem. This is only achievable, of course, if the reader is cognizant of Hunsigana's way, which denotes the ability on the part of the indigent to freely take up those components that they find useful while leaving those parts that are deleterious to Black indigenous ontology out of the equation. That's where I'll end. I'll stop there. Take a couple of questions if there are any questions from what is it? Because I know we were also live streaming. Vanessa? Okay. No, that's Vanessa. Okay, so I've just been asked by Vanessa to let folks know that if they have any questions, they should feel free to raise their hand, just so that we can be able to address those questions. That's what I want to do. Oh. Questions. There is one question on the paper being made available. I'm trying to publish this paper. It's been very, very difficult to publish this paper. It has, for a number of reasons. One of them is the fact that in this country, we have really, really cool gatekeepers who kind of just, don't want to be dislodged and don't want to facilitate modes of entry. So I would be keen maybe to share the paper privately because, as I say, I'm trying to publish it. So I don't know. Yeah, I could do that. Folks can just reach out to me. I would do that. Any questions?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Atwal Ima. I'm a scholar of African literature and African gender studies located in the US. I am also a Black person in the world, so I just want to just sort of situate my questions, because I'm wondering if, and again, thinking about, interdisciplinarity is part of what my question wants to focus on. And I'm thinking about that, and I guess I'm asking you to also think alongside me and thinking, of course, that yes, I am in the US, right? So just, to kind of frame my question. But within the US Academy, interdisciplinarity has become very, has become very sort of commodified, right? It's become a kind of object of delight and fetishization. And so people oftentimes describe their work as interdisciplinary. So I'm wondering how you might respond to that, right, as a kind of contradiction to your claim that interdisciplinarity is a sort of essential mode of thinking within a kind of decolonial university or decolonial intellectual space. My second question is similar in that it is asking you to think about the Black archive, again, a frame that within the US, or I should say particularly in the Western Academy, emerging as we're articulating it within Black studies. We have been talking about the ways that the Black archive is always already partial and fragmented, and particularly because we are thinking about it through the historical legacies of slavery. But we can also think about the ways, as you have, I think, also commented, how intellectual and activist and forms of cultural production have been marginalized because of coloniality and whiteness and white supremacy. So I'm just wondering how you might respond to what could be read as contradictions or amendments or sites of difference if we're thinking about Blackness as a kind of universal ontology that escapes the borders of South Africa, if that might be a helpful part of your discussion if you're thinking in those directions as well. So thank you.
Thank you, colleague, for that intervention. I'll start with the first question, right? Because I think there were three questions in that, because the last question comes up as a concluding remark, as you kind of conclude your questions in terms of maybe thinking beyond the South African condition of Blackness. So I'll start with the first question, which talks to the commodification and fetishization of Blackness, of interdisciplinarity. And I'm working with, I'm not necessarily working with interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary research methodologies. I'm working with indisciplinary methodologies, right? So I want to go beyond trans, multi, interdisciplinary methods. And I use the concept of indisciplinary, I borrow it from a foreword that Walter Mignolo did to a book that I edited with the HSRC Press titled Decolonization and Democratization, Global Insights into the South African Experience. And he uses this concept because he's trying to suggest that in multi, inter, and what's the other one? Multi, inter, and what's the other one? I forget now, but transdisciplinarity, we are still working within disciplinary configurations and modes of thinking, right? Like and what I'm trying to do is to say there are aspects from which I need to borrow. I need to borrow from literary theory. I need to borrow from history and historiography. I need to borrow from political theory. And I'm situated in philosophy, right? So, but I'm bringing all of these components in because all of these components allow me to read a particular question or read a particular socio-political phenomenon. And that is, of course, the existential question of Blackness in a quote unquote post-colonial society that still privileges colonial cultural practices and colonial and ascribes hegemonic status to colonial cultural identities and signifiers and markers, right? So I'm thinking in an indisciplined way. I want to get to a point where I don't have to say I'm drawing from literary theory, I'm drawing from historiography, political theory as a philosopher. I want to be able to do this work in and of itself. And I think this leads me to the third part of your question, which was to say, can we think about a universal can we think about Blackness more universally outside of the confines of the South African perspective or the South African condition? And I think we can, right? In the sense that what I'm trying to articulate and respond to in the South African context is, or rather, are the realities of Black South Africans. And I will admit that there are similarities in terms of the struggles that we share with our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, with our brothers and sisters in the North American diasporic community, as well as in the South American diasporic communities, right? Because there are Black folk who exist in all of those spaces. But the site-specific particularities are going to be very, very interesting, right? So for instance, in South Africa, we have necklacing and we don't have lynching, right? So Black men aren't lynched in South Africa, but they are necklaced for transgressing certain political certain political objectives or targets that we're all aiming for, right? And I'm interested in those subtle differences. I'm very, very interested in those subtle differences because, again, I'm trying to think about, and this is, I think, a very, very interesting question that you've put, Satoli, for me, because I think of the work that I'm doing and the kind of work that I'll be doing coming to the United States now in terms of taking up the Harvard Fellowship, right? And it's interesting because the United States is the epicenter of, not the United States, but North America and Europe. That's, especially Western Europe, that's where the big five are, right? That's where the big debates are, and that's where people are leading the debates in terms of whatever particular discipline one is coming from, or one might be coming from. And that's fascinating because what it does, and this is one of the critiques that I put against my good colleague Tendai Sithole in the Black Register. Tendai Sithole reads the South African context in terms of the Black existence in South Africa using an Afro-pessimistic lens, that I think sometimes doesn't do the work of clarifying where the Black South African experience merges and meets or is similar to the African American experience, and where those lines begin also to differ, right? So where do we merge and where do we differ? And I think that it's important for us to make those distinctions because, again, in South Africa, for instance, and as recently as the 80s, 70s, 80s, and even the 90s, I have the condition of Black men being necklaced, Black men and women being necklaced in South Africa, whereas, for instance, in the United States, you have the existence or the reality of lynching, right? And so I'm just curious about us kind of drawing those similarities out, but also kind of making those distinctions in order for us to articulate theoretical propositions and to develop theory that does this work of attending to the socio-political needs of our local communities while keeping an eye on the international trajectories or global trajectories of where our disciplines are going. And then the final question that you had asked was the question of the Black Archive and how, of course, the Black Archive has been treated because of the fact that we're always in response. And I think that this is the advantage, again, that I have in the context of speaking from the South African perspective, with the South African, Black South African context. I've got access to a certain language in the first respect. So Make Mafuze in the 1800s, moving into the early 1900s, is writing, and I have access to that work where he writes about right, in terms of the origins of Black folk, whereby he's thinking through the question of where do we come from. I've got access to that work, right? And I think I'm interested in a colleague who inspired me quite radically, an inspiration that meant that our capacity to collaborate kind of dissipated. And this was Leonard Prague, where he says, instead of always trying to speak back to whiteness, trying to respond to whiteness, just do the work of in interest and invest yourself in your own folk. And I think when I began to do that and to do it seriously, it caused the rift, it caused the collapse in terms of our capacity to continue to collaborate. Because at a certain point, I was like, well, I'm not interested in whiteness at this point. I'm interested in Blackness and where Blackness is coming from, because I've got those aspects of access and entryway. And this is not to dismiss, of course, that to a certain extent, we're dealing with the work of remembering, what Sabelo Ndlovu-Katsheni and Ngugiwa Thiong'o call this concept of remembering, right? So reassembling the fragments of ourselves that have been a result of colonial incursion, slavery, and of course, neoliberal conceptions of the world in terms of the modern world. So I think to a certain extent, the response to how I'm thinking about and where I'm working from vis-a-vis the Black Archive is interesting in the dissimilarities in terms of our own context. And the question that I would then pose, colleague, as a way of responding maybe to your question, is to say, how is what I'm doing in the South African context maybe empowering of the kind of investigations that have been done in the United States of America concerning the Black Archive, insofar as the Black Archive in the United States takes us back to that moment of slavery, takes us back to that moment of those fragments that require the remembering that Ngugiwa Thiong'o and Sabelo Ndlovu-Katsheni suggest in their work and in their writing. I hope I've attended to some of the concerns and questions, and as I think I like how you phrased your questions as well, which is to say thinking alongside each other. So I don't think I can give definitive responses, but I do think maybe we can think alongside each other. And I hope that my thoughts have been useful in responding to some of the concerns that you raised. Ntabi Singh? Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for your response. Very rich and much to think about.
Thank you. Ntabi Singh?
Hi, and thanks so much for a really, really interesting, riveting presentation. So I was reading lately something that a few Black academics I think are quite unhappy with in terms of the NRF. And this was spurred by what you're talking about, trying to publish and the gatekeeping comment that you made just now. And an idea that perhaps there should be, perhaps we need a specialist committee that is around decolonization, looking at aspects of indigenization, Africanization, right? Partly because in the way that current systems are structured, knowledge systems are structured, as well as institutions, they really play into, Lewis Gordon's idea of disciplinary decadence around this whole thing of sustaining the status quo. And so I'd be interested in whether you agree, you would agree with that, and maybe go even a bit further of how do we actually begin to address this disciplinary decadence that we find in our institution, we find in our disciplines, and we find in funding structures, which results in very material outcomes, which is perhaps those who are evaluating are situated within the current status quo. And so these kinds of works, which are perhaps challenging, hegemonic knowledge systems might be problematic. How do we maneuver around this, institutionally? And then I was just quite interested. The second question was around your the politics of citation. A lot of your the authors you're citing are Black South African authors. And I was just interested in that journey of your positionality around it and how, you navigated that and the theoretical choices you were making, particularly when it comes to the politics of citation. Thanks.
Thank you, Ntabi Singh. Can I take Pascal, and then I'll go to the comments, the questions that are in the chat just before, after I've given my response to Ntabi Singh's and Pascal's question. Pascal, please go ahead. I wonder if there we go. Thank you.
Yes, can you hear me? Thank you so much thank you so much, Siseko, for such a fantastic talk. And I'm particularly interested, Pascal, I'm in the UK, and I'm particularly interested in how one can decolonize in a UK university, which can be seen as a site or can be described as a site, described as a colonizer's site where epistemic privilege and violence are articulated, enhanced, and or maintained. And another issue is there's an issue of neoliberal capitalism or profit-oriented conceptualization of decolonization to attract more students to UK universities. So do you think these universities are employing decolonization as a form of, borrowing my earlier colleague's observation, are they employing decolonization as a form of fetishization and also as a marketing tool? Finally, very short one, is there something like Black optics or Black gaze as a tool to of or a form of binoculars to look for archives or Black archives to contribute to decolonization? I'm just trying to borrow from queer optics, so that's why I was thinking about, as you're presenting, about Black optics, Black gaze, I know it can sometimes or often be violent in a way, so a form of violence. So I was just thinking along those terms, is there something like black optics, black gaze as a tool of decolonization, or can we develop it as also maybe a form of methodology, or well, something like work in progress? Thank you so much again for your fantastic presentation.
Thank you, colleague. So I'd like to respond to both Ntabiseng and Pascal. Thank you, colleagues, for those thought-provoking questions. Ntabiseng, I'll tell you something that I've taken to doing. I've taken to getting out of the South African context in terms of trying to publish some of this work, just because, and there are notorious spaces, journal publication spaces in this country that gate out Black South African contributors, systematically so. If you were to review those publications over the past 3 years, I think you'd find something like 20% of Black South African voices contributing. And these, by the way, are the journals that are the journals in our disciplines. And I think there's a point in time, I'm going to release a public think piece, because I've had a challenge recently with one of these journals in this country, not for the first time. Over the past 8 years, I've had a challenge with this particular journal, where, and what they've taken to doing now is that colleagues have taken to reviewing the work and returning it with an outcome of a rejection without any reviewer's comments, which is rather strange. And I do want to think aloud. I do want to think aloud about what that means, and who are the people, who are the folks included, who are the folks excluded, and on what premise do we make those decisions. So the point that I'm just going to make, colleague, is to say I've taken to publishing outside, and it does quite a couple of things as well, that idea of publishing outside, because if you actually look to the Nordic, the Journal of Nordic African Studies, I believe it's called, published from Uppsala University. They're working quite extensively on this question of the Black Archive, and I found that maybe that might be a community of scholarship that I would like to join, in the sense of try and get the work out there. So I think one of the things that we have to think about is to say we should not be limited by the gatekeeping strategies that take place in South Africa. And when you do that kind of work, when you publish abroad, it also looks good, in the sense that when you go up for NRF rating, it looks good on your CV, but that then falls into the trap of the contribution that came from our first question, as well as what Pascal is now asking, in terms of the fetishization of and the commodification of the work that we're doing, which is to say we're always profit-driven. Our universities, because of the neoliberal tendencies that govern our institutions, are always profit-driven, in the sense of thinking about, well, how much money can you make from this kind of work, right? And I think it's about really kind of, for me, it's really attending to what is driving the work. The work is attending to the concerns and lived realities of Black South Africans, and really enlivening the White Paper 3 of 1997, which says that the higher education system, or the scientific system of the country, needs to deepen democracy. It needs to redress the inequalities of the past. And I think there's a curious thing that happens as well in the intellectual circles of this country, and maybe even in the intellectual circles of the world, right? Whereby we say that academic spaces, that intellectual spaces ought to be spaces that drive universities, in any case, because most of our universities are public institutions in this country in any case. But we say that knowledge ought to drive, the purposes of attending to real socio-political questions, real concerns, whether they be medical, as we saw, for instance, with the outbreak of the pandemic, and how intellectuals within the medical fraternities took to really using their knowledge to responding to an immediate human crisis, or whether it is a question of hunger or climate change, right? Or resource redistribution. What we should be doing with knowledge is that we should be attending to real human questions. And I think if one thinks of it in those terms, it doesn't matter whether I publish in South Africa, whether I publish in Germany, whether I publish in the UK, whether I publish in the United States of America, it doesn't. And I also think that there's a certain aspect where we do need to think about creating bigger communities of collaboration that go beyond the South African context, because sometimes South African intellectual circles can begin to sound like echo chambers just because the gatekeepers have gated us out of certain spaces and continue to do so, by the way, right? And when you begin to, when you are included and you begin to buck the system very easily reminds you of the fact that actually you don't belong here. And this then brings me to your second question, Thabiseng, of the politics of citation in terms of how I made my choices, in terms of who I'm engaging, who I'm reading, and how I'm reading them in terms of the theoretical underpinnings that inform my work. And I'll say this, I'm curious about my people. I'm curious about what it would look like to actually produce in this country an intellectual who does what an intellectual is supposed to do, which is to say, develops knowledge that responds to the conditions of our people. Now, you will notice that in engaging in a conversation with South African intellectuals in terms of the politics of citation, I'm not only limited to say, but this is a South African context. Hannah Arendt gives me a bit of some insight, with drawbacks, of course, even in her own context, because Hannah Arendt is very quiet on the question of Africa, lest she is analyzing the question of apartheid in South Africa in, for instance, the origins to totalitarianism, right? And she traces how the condition of South Africa becomes the condition of South Africa through Afrikanerdom and apartheid, and what that then subsequently means. But she's very quiet on the question of Africa, on the question of blackness. And she even says in the interview that she gave, I believe it was in 1956, Hannah Arendt was a person, she says it very clearly. She says, I don't have the credentials, as it were, to speak on the black question because I don't necessarily have, and she put it very politely, but I think she was saying, I'm not interested in that question because I'm interested in the Jewish question, right? I'm interested in my own people. And I understand that, I appreciate it. So the point that I'm just getting at is to say I'm talking with and I'm talking to South Africans in terms of the politics of citation, but I also draw from other spaces recognizing their own limitations. Now, to get to Pascal's first question around decolonization in the United Kingdom, and again, the profit margin / metaphization / fetishization of decolonization, I think it is possible to do decolonial work in the United Kingdom, Pascal. And I say this because I collaborate with a couple of colleagues at King's College in London, working with the Faculty of Social Sciences and Public Policy, specifically in terms of trying to think about the kind of work that I'm doing here at home and how that work links up to the kinds of projects. Because one of the things that I've noticed, by the way, as well about contexts such as the United Kingdom, Germany, the United States, Canada, is that they have a huge number of our students reading, continental students in the sense of Africa, as well as South America, reading in those spaces, right? So the students are putting up the questions, they're putting up the resistance to say, but actually we need to be engaged in the processes of decolonizing these institutions, because these institutions were the vanguard and sponsors of colonial violence, etc. So I do think that that work is possible. What I think maybe we can think about is to say, how do we create networks, open up networks of those Black students who are reading in contexts such as the United Kingdom, such that they could be able to put it to the master in the master's house to say, well, what are we going to do about questions of colonial violence and history, and of course, the question of reparations, right? But in any case, let me leave that one for this evening. But I do think that the work is possible. I think that the work can happen by ways of creating networks that can hold that work in very, very useful ways. And then to think about the concept of Black optics, the Black gaze as a form of methodology itself, I think to a certain extent, colleagues, I think we're all doing similar kind of work. And I do think that we can look into the processes of a Black gaze or Black optics as a methodological tool that we are able to deploy in the kind of research questions and research pursuits that we are engaged in. I think what mine was trying to demonstrate here this evening is to say that if we're going to go into that space of creativity in terms of working with our own experiences, because nobody's going to do this work. No, in terms of the professoriate in South Africa that I know of, they're very far few and between white professors in this country who will actively pursue questions that concern the Black condition. Very, very far few and between. And so if we're going to wait for somebody to do that for us, I think we're going to wait until Christ comes again. And it seems as though he's not coming anytime soon, right? So what I'm suggesting here is that in the processes of being imaginative about what we're doing, I think it's imperative for us to also institutionalize the work that we're doing by giving ourselves and the students that we're training the tools with which to continue the projects that we're undertaking in our work. And I think it's important, it's really, really important, you know, to also kind of, I suppose, coalesce around ways and strategies of doing that. So how do we raise funding for certain projects? How do we institutionalize certain projects? How do we get certain material published? Where do we get it published? Those are the kinds of questions that I think we need to be working around, because I think the Black experience is legitimate. And this is something that I didn't talk to today that's not in this particular paper, but I'm very, very interested in the question of ontological legitimacy as it concerns Blackness. I'm very, very interested in that. And what it means for us to reckon with Blackness as possessing ontological legitimacy. And I think the world looks very different when we begin to have that conversation. The world looks incredibly, incredibly different. And I think that the concept or the process of understanding ontological legitimacy as it concerns Blackness, the process of that work lies with us as Black intellectuals who are in the system, who are training intellectuals who will succeed us. I hope those responses are useful to the questions. I just want to quickly run through the comments that are in the questions that are in the comment section, because I see that we are running out of time. So Lebo says, thank you so much for a fascinating paper. I'm not sure I heard your definition of decoloniality and whether decoloniality is a branch of post-colonial theory. Please pardon me if you answered this question, but perhaps clarify the relationship of the two. I will suggest, Lebo, that maybe you go to the work of Sabelo Dlovukajeni. I would suggest that you go to the work of Tebohole Bakeng. I would also suggest that you maybe go to the work of Uspamandla Zondi, because these colleagues have really systematically over the years given us the definition of what decoloniality is, what it is concerned with, and how it differs from post-colonial theory. And the definition of decoloniality that I give in this particular paper is situated in three moves. A decolonized university that B, allows me to develop theory using the Black archive, which C, that theory is then responsive to the local conditions of my communities while being attendant to global trajectories of the discipline. But if you're wanting a systematic and thorough scholarly engagement with that question of the distinction between decoloniality and post-colonial theory, as I say, the work of Sabelo Dlovukajeni, the work of Uspamandla Zondi, as well as the work of colleagues such as Ngugiwa Thiong'o, those are characters that I think would be very, very useful in that regard. Now, Tana says, I'm interested in what you're saying about decolonial theories having to be both responsive and future-oriented. How can the methodology you've outlined be used to analyze current rather than past cultural production as a means to facilitate ongoing emancipation? I will direct you, Mahoka, to a paper that I've done titled Khawuleza and Instantiation of the Black Archive, whereby I do that process of surfacing how Black women have theorized their lived experiences using the work of, for instance, musicians, and this is actually this is the paper and how it proceeds. I start off with Nina Simone's 4 Women. I move on to Busimhlongo Ziyaphela Imali Ngibhalela Wena Sokalami. I move on to Miriam Makeba's Khawuleza, move on to Letambulu's Not Yet Uhuru, and I begin concluding the paper with a a reflection on the kinds of methods of invention and self-styling that Black women have through the creative process in analyzing Som for Pulane by Liomile, right? And I conclude the piece by going back to Oliver Mtukudzi's Garwanaka, and I demonstrate how the methodology that I'm working with, and that is an instantiation, Kauleza, an instantiation of the Black Archive, a paper that came out in 2020, published with Imbizo, demonstrates precisely what it is that I'm trying to do here. So I'm defining a methodology here because I've already begun doing the work. I've already begun applying myself to the processes of actioning this Black Archive methodology. And I hope that answers the question in the sense of using contemporary work in the process of ongoing emancipation. Sean Mavundla, colleague, I see we've got 5 minutes left, so I'll take your question as the last one, and then I think we can begin to wrap up. Please go ahead, colleague Sean.
Thank you very much, Prof. Sesego, for quite an interesting and insightful presentation. For me, it was definitely illuminating and sparked quite a number of thoughts in me. But I just wanted to quickly pick up on the aspect of decolonization and your engagement with, I think it was Pascal, if I'm not mistaken. For me, there's something quite interesting that you said in terms of how there's very few white professors and doctors that actively pursue questions of the Black condition. And I would even add to that there's also quite a number of few even Black professors and doctors that are genuinely interested in the Black condition and not use it as a way of commodification, as you were engaging with Pascal. So for me, one of the questions that I have is, there's quite a massive incentive in terms of maintaining the status quo. That is the teaching of colonial education. And one needs to be aware that the projects that we are currently undertaking in terms of teaching decolonial work is very important, because it does not only affect academia, but it affects politics, it affects our socioeconomic conditions. Because for me, one of the things that I say is that there cannot be self-determination without economic liberation. And in order for us to be aware of such things, it's important that we actually engage in decolonial work. So what I want to know is that if we have these massive white professors and doctors, and even Black ones, that continue to teach colonized education, and it actually, for example, took a movement like Fees Must Fall to actually make people aware that this education that we are being taught or have been taught is actually colonial education. So how are then we expected to have the very same Black professors and doctors that criticized the Fees Must Fall movement when it called for a free and decolonized education? How can we expect them to be the ones that again teach decolonized education when they haven't undertaken the critical work of actually educating themselves in how they've been instrumental in perpetuating colonized education?
I quite like that question, and I'm just gonna say, look out for a paper of mine that's going to be coming out with the Journal of Philosophy of Education, hopefully in the next, maybe give me 2-3 months, if all goes well, because I treat this question of miseducation, right, and how the process of miseducation has even been internalized by some of the colleagues that we find within the academy, in the sense of colleagues believe that knowledge is only knowledge insofar as it emanates, for instance, from Europe or North America. So I think it's, I to a certain extent, I do call out, especially my fellow philosophers, Black philosophers, who perpetuate this kind of thinking. I do call them out, but I am also generous enough to understand that we are produced by a system, a system that has always said philosophy is Heidegger, philosophy is Kierkegaard, philosophy is Wittgenstein. And I'm not saying we ought not to read those philosophers. I do believe that in terms of thinking about our own condition, they're useful maybe to surfacing certain similarities, etc., and ways of thinking. But I do believe, and I attended a talk by my good colleague Untitled Chapter, hosted here at the University of Johannesburg by the Ali Mazrui Center for Higher Education Studies. And Usabela basically says, you know, it's a curious thing, really. It's a curious thing. The centrality ought to be our own context in the first instance. So if I am teaching from a decolonial perspective, the starting point needs to be South Africa. Then I expand to SADC as a region. Then I expand to the continent. Then I expand globally. It should not be the inverse, because when I go, as I will tomorrow, for instance, to Harvard, I'm not going to find folks thinking about South Africa as the initial starting point. They're not. They're thinking about their own contexts, engaging with scholars and theoreticians who are developing knowledge from their own context. And as a last consideration, if at all even, colleagues will then include an analysis that maybe features South Africa, right? So I think it's a matter of really kind of thinking about where are we situated and why are we producing knowledge? Why are we engaged in the process of producing knowledge, right? And I think that's the simplest way I can answer the question, because in that paper titled Pedagogical Obligation, whereby I conduct an auto critique of my own teaching methodologies, I'm curious about the aims of education and what it is that we owe to our students. Bernard Martellino, for instance, who had been at UKZN for quite a while and now recently joined the University of Pretoria, has thought about this particular question of what do philosophers owe to their students? So if you just Google that concept, what do philosophers owe their students, by Bernard Martellino, that paper should pop up. And he considers exactly these questions of the ways in which we have internalized even maybe certain ways of thinking about philosophy. Because I think, as a final and concluding thought, I think that many of us are still haunted by what we call in philosophy Hegel's ghost. Because Hegel basically says, and what is it? Trevor Roper also kind of makes this Hugh Trevor Roper also makes this claim that there is no history in Africa, only the history of Europeans in Africa. And then he goes on to say there is no history in Africa, only darkness, and darkness is no subject of history. Now, this was one of the most influential professors of history at Oxford University in the previous century, Hugh Trevor Roper. And he himself is drawing from the Hegelian claim that says that in order for the world to articulate a certain conception of understanding, it ought to look to Europe, with Germany, of course, as the epicenter, as in Hegel's view of Europe. And this is why Sabine Ndlovu-Katsheni says that we need to deprovincialize knowledge and to decolonize, to deprovincialize ourselves and decolonize, in the sense of, to a very, very large extent, the stuff that's coming out of Europe that is regarded as, you know, universal logic and universal knowledge, it's actually very provincial. It was a group of white old men thinking about their own context and dismissing everything else. And if you go back to Bertrand Russell's recommendation in that last essay of his in that publication that came out in 1912, The Problems of Philosophy, he says that true philosophic contemplation comes in the self, extending oneself in the sense of being abroad with the other. That is what fulfills true philosophic contemplation. And a lot of these Europeans have kind of, you know, they haven't been able to do that work. They haven't been able to be abroad with the other and subsequently fulfill that category of true philosophic contemplation. Colleagues, I see we're 3 minutes past 6. I do apologize for running over time. Thank you very much to everybody in the room for their comments, questions, and really, really insightful provocations. I see a request there by Jenny. What I will do, Jenny, is that I will ask the JIAS team to circulate my reference list from the paper. So that I can do. I can very easily circulate the references that I've used for this paper to all members who had signed up to attend this lecture. Colleagues, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for the engagement as well. Thank you.